the summer of 1953, a democratically elected prime minister stood at the window of his own home while tanks rolled through the streets of his capital. He had not lost an election. He had not been overthrown by his own people in any organic uprising. He had been erased from power by men who never set foot on a battlefield, who fired no shots themselves, and who worked instead through bribery, propaganda, rented mobs, and whispered promises to generals. This was not war in any conventional sense. It was something new, something quieter, and something that would define the next 70 years of global politics. Regime change by intelligence agency. 2 years earlier, halfway across the world, the pattern had already been tested in Central America against a government accused of nothing more than redistributing unused farmland. These were not isolated events. They were the opening chapters of a doctrine, forged in the earliest years of the Cold War, in which unelected officers in Washington decided which governments abroad were acceptable and which were not, and acted in secret to make that judgment permanent. To understand how the modern world's balance of power was shaped, we must return to the moment intelligence services stopped merely gathering secrets and started making history. The story begins not with a coup, but with a signature. In the summer of 1947, President Harry Truman signed the National Security Act, a piece of legislation born from the chaos of the Second World War and the fear that America's scattered wartime intelligence networks had left the nation blind to emerging threats. Buried within that act was the creation of a new institution, the Central Intelligence Agency. Its founding charter spoke of coordinating intelligence and advising the National Security Council. It said almost nothing about overthrowing foreign governments. Yet, within a handful of years, that omission would be filled by practice rather than by law. The world the CIA was born into was one already splitting in two. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had collapsed almost as soon as the guns fell silent in Europe. Eastern Europe had disappeared behind what Winston Churchill called an Iron Curtain. In Washington, policymakers came to believe that the Soviet Union was not merely a rival power but an ideological contagion, one that could spread not through invading armies but through popular movements, elections, and nationalist governments that leaned even slightly toward neutrality or socialism. Containment became the watchword of American foreign policy. But containment on the battlefield was expensive and risky, especially with the Soviet Union now possessing its own atomic weapons after 1949. A cheaper, quieter alternative began to take shape. Containment through covert action, waged not by armies but by case officers, forged newspapers, suitcases of cash, and cultivated generals. It was in Iran that this doctrine received its first true test on a national scale. Iran in the early 1950s was a nation defined by a single, overwhelming grievance. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British-controlled enterprise, extracted enormous wealth from Iranian oil fields while returning only a small fraction of the profits to the Iranian state. Iranian workers labored in poor conditions while shareholders in London grew wealthy. Into this grievance stepped Mohammad Mossadegh, an aristocratic lawyer and parliamentarian who became prime minister in 1951 on a wave of nationalist fervor. Mossadegh's central demand was simple and, to Iranians, entirely reasonable. Nationalize the oil industry so that its wealth would benefit the Iranian people rather than a foreign corporation. In March of 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to do exactly that. For Britain, this was catastrophic. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was one of the crown jewels of British overseas investment, and its refinery at Abadan was among the largest in the world. British officials pressured Washington to help reverse the nationalization, initially without success. The Truman administration was wary of being seen to prop up colonial-style oil arrangements. But when Dwight Eisenhower entered the White House in 1953, the political calculation shifted. Eisenhower's administration, gripped by anti-communist anxiety and increasingly persuaded by British arguments that Mossadegh's government was unstable and vulnerable to communist influence from the Tudeh party, agreed to act. The operation was given the name Ajax, and its architect on the American side was Kermit Roosevelt, a CIA officer and grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. What followed was a textbook demonstration of covert political warfare. American and British intelligence funneled money to Iranian newspaper editors, clergy, and street organizers. Mobs were paid to demonstrate in the streets, some posing as communists to alarm the middle class, others posing as royalists to demand the restoration of the young Shah's full authority. Military officers loyal to the monarchy were bribed and coordinated. The plan initially faltered when the Shah, uncertain and fearful, fled the country rather than issuing the decree meant to dismiss Mossadegh. For several tense days it appeared the operation had failed entirely. But Roosevelt and his Iranian collaborators improvised, using the same networks of paid crowds and bribed officers to stage a second push. On August 19, 1953, pro-Shah crowds and army units moved on Mossadegh's residence. After a brief exchange of gunfire, Mossadegh's home fell, and he was arrested. The Shah returned from exile within days, his throne secured not by popular mandate but by a foreign intelligence operation. The consequences were immediate and long-lasting. A new oil consortium was formed, granting Western companies, including American firms for the first time, a substantial share of Iranian oil production. The Shah, restored to power through foreign intervention, increasingly ruled through his secret police and grew ever more dependent on American backing. Mossadegh spent the rest of his life largely confined to his family estate. And in Washington, the operation was hailed internally as a triumph, proof that a relatively small, cheap covert action could achieve what might otherwise have required military intervention or diplomatic negotiation. It set a template that intelligence planners would return to again and again. That template was applied again within a year, this time in Guatemala. Since 1944, Guatemala had been undergoing what its supporters called a democratic revolution, ending decades of dictatorship and instituting new labor rights, expanded suffrage, and social reforms. In 1951, Jacobo Árbenz became president and pushed these reforms further with Decree 900, a sweeping land reform law that expropriated and used portions of large estates, compensating owners based on the value they themselves had declared for tax purposes, and redistributed that land to landless peasants. Among the landowners affected was the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with vast holdings in Guatemala and considerable political connections in Washington. United Fruit's executives argued that Árbenz government was a communist beachhead in the Western Hemisphere, pointing to the participation of Guatemala's small communist party in his coalition and to land reform itself as evidence of dangerous radicalism. The Eisenhower administration, primed by the perceived success in Iran and staffed by officials with direct personal and professional ties to United Fruit, approved a covert operation known as PB Success. Rather than relying on internal Guatemalan actors alone, the CIA built and equipped a small rebel force under Carlos Castillo Armas, an exiled Guatemalan army officer, training them in neighboring Honduras and Nicaragua. The operation's most powerful weapon, however, was not the rebel army itself, which numbered only a few hundred poorly equipped fighters, but a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign. A CIA-run clandestine radio station calling itself the Voice of Liberation broadcast false reports of massive troop movements and imminent invasion, sowing panic and confusion within Guatemala's military high command. When Castillo Armas's small force crossed the border in June of 1954, it made only limited military progress, but the psychological operation had already done its work. Convinced that a much larger force was closing in and unwilling to fight to defend Árbenz, Guatemala's army leadership pressured the president to resign. Árbenz stepped down, and Castillo Armas assumed power with American backing. Guatemala's land reforms were swiftly reversed, and much of the seized land was returned to its previous owners, including United Fruit. What followed for Guatemala was decades of military rule, political repression, and eventually a brutal civil war that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives over the following 4 decades. For Washington, however, the operation was again counted as a success, further confirming the emerging doctrine. Covert intervention was cheaper than war, deniable to the public, and capable of producing outcomes favorable to American strategic and economic interests. By the mid-1950s, a pattern had crystallized. Intelligence agencies had discovered that the machinery of a state, its newspapers, its army officers, its street crowds, its radio waves, could be manipulated from the outside with remarkable efficiency, provided the operation remained hidden from the public that had elected the government being removed. The immediate architects of these operations viewed them as surgical successes. Swift, low cost, and low casualty compared to the alternative of open military conflict. What they did not yet grapple with, or perhaps did not wish to grapple with, was what these operations meant for the countries left behind, and what long-term instability, resentment, and authoritarian rule they had helped set in motion. The tools sharpened in Tehran and Guatemala City would soon be pointed at ambitions far more difficult to fulfill, in places far more resistant to quiet manipulation, and the very doctrine that seemed so successful in its infancy would begin to reveal both its power and its limits on a global stage.